right. Like I said, that was my roller skating jam from 1996. So we got to relive that. Eighth grade, freshman year of high school, all that good stuff. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Literacy is Liberation, Honoring Student Identities in Classroom Communities. This is the first of 6 sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays this August that work to bring together the work of Dr. Kimberly Parker, the author of Literacy is Liberation, and the Literacy Essentials for grades 4 and 5 and grades 6 through 12. Each of our sessions stands alone, so you don't need to come to all 6, although we welcome you to come to all 6 in person or register if you haven't yet, because even if you register but can't make it, you do get the video recording a little bit later. And you don't need to have read Dr. Parker's book to be with us today and make meaning with us and join us and be a part of this community. So we just want to definitely let you know that. If you were one of the first 25 people to register for this session, you'll soon be receiving a code in your email that you provided at registration to download Dr. Parker's book. So look for that maybe later tonight or tomorrow morning. And just one more reminder to please take a moment to sign in either using the QR code on the screen or the link in the chat. This helps our amazing support staff, again, get you the sketch credit for attending today's session. As we get started, I'm going to ask you to drop your name, your role in education, and where you're zooming in from today in the chat so that we can get a sense of who's in the room. And while you're doing that, I'm also going to ask you to grab a notebook or open a Google Doc or find some other comfortable writing space as we're going to be doing a lot of reflection today. And it would be helpful to have something to write with, whether it's your notes app, a Google Doc, piece of paper, whatever works for you. So in the chat, your name, your role in education, and where you're zooming from today. Thanks, everybody. Hi, Christy. Hi, Natalie. Bob, welcome. Jill. Rebecca, April, Malia, Andrea. Good to see you here today. Thank you. Thank you for giving an hour of your summer to us. We appreciate that. Christy, Colleen, hello. As you're introducing yourself, we want to introduce ourselves. My name is Jeff Austin. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm a literacy consultant at Wayne Risa. I'm going to be presenting today's session, but this work would not have been possible without amazing colleagues who helped design and will be presenting other sessions in this series. So Laura Gabrion, who's here today, who's back channeling, which I appreciate. Rosalyn, Shahid, and Jennifer Snap will also be sharing their brilliance with us throughout the month. This was really a team effort. I think these sessions are going to be really great. So if you're here today, I definitely, again, welcome you to sign up for the other 5 because, the brilliance is really collective and, we really shared a lot in this work. So it was really beautiful. So you'll be seeing these people throughout August too, and you're going to learn a ton from them. Want to do a land acknowledgement. I really appreciate everybody, Rob, Audrey, April, sharing where you're zooming in from today in the chat, just to get a sense of who's in the room. We're zooming from Wayne Risa today, which rests on the ancestral land of several indigenous tribes, including the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires tribes, which are comprised of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. The Fox, Wyandotte, and Miami tribes also were in the area where Risa is currently located. The United States took this land as part of Session 66 in 1807. The tribes named in the treaty were the Chippewa, Ottawa, Wyandotte, and Potawatomi. We encourage you to do more research about the history of this treaty. And we also encourage you, as you're doing that research, to consider the motivations behind its creation, as well as its long-term impacts on our region and the generations of people who were impacted. We're going to be here for about 75 minutes or so till about 4:15. So we kind of want to let you know how we'll be using our time. Over the next 75 minutes or so, we'll be discussing the rationale for today's session, going through some values and working agreements. We'll be diving into Dr. Parker's work with a pick a quote activity. We'll look at some research on how identity affirming instruction lifts all students. We're going to consider what we mean when we say literacy and liberation and how it connects to those literacy essentials in grades 4 and 5 and the disciplinary literacy essentials in grades 6 through 12. And we'll spend a little bit of time debriefing together to consider what this means for all of us as we enter another school year. Throughout the presentation, another thing to be aware of is that we've attempted to be transparent about our facilitation to be in relationship with you, to encourage the practice of sharing vulnerability, and to model responsive facilitation. So throughout the presentation today, you'll see light bulbs on certain slides, noting these facilitation moves and why they're being used. In this spirit, we wanted to share a short video our team made about our equity beliefs, values, and commitments. As you're watching this short video, we're asking you to reflect on two questions. First, what in the video affirms your current classroom practices? And then what in the video invites you to continue growing your practice in the upcoming school year? I'll play our video and then ask you again to think about what affirms you here and what maybe invites you into a new practice or an evolving practice for the upcoming school year.
We, the Wayne Risa Literacy Team, continue to explore, learn, and collaborate with one another in an effort to advance literacy practices that promote equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racist. To that end, we have crafted beliefs and commitments to advancing this work. We believe literacy is actionable, liberatory, and humanizing. We believe robust interdisciplinary literacy instruction empowers students' voice and agency to enact positive change. We believe equitable literacy instruction connects to students' identities by linking literacy to their histories and cultures while developing their skills, intellect, criticality, and joy. We believe equitable literacy practices are not static. They are ongoing and fluid. We believe in fostering opportunities for students to improve their reading, writing, thinking, and speaking abilities in ways that prepare them to more fully understand power, oppression, equity, and how they might lift their voice for positive change. We believe students should have access to enabling texts that are culturally and socially relevant and tasks that are robust and engaging. We also believe to enact change, we must examine our own biases and develop knowledge of our world by exploring multiple perspectives. So to that end, we pledge to create brave spaces that honor individual and collective journeys, to interrogate our beliefs as they pertain to pedagogy, curriculum, and school policies. We also pledge to facilitate courageous conversations and to push our growing edge. If you are interested in starting these conversations in your school or district, please see the link below for the works that have inspired us, and we thank you.
So the reflections about what affirms and invites you into the video provide us with an entry point into today's session. The thinking you've just completed is really foundational. And I'm going to ask you to keep it in the front of your mind as we move through today's session. One of the things that I want to say before we move any further, that's really, I think, important to mention is that you might find some edges here today, some pieces that might make you uncomfortable, particularly those pieces that maybe are inviting you to grow your practice or to push you maybe in a little bit of a different direction. And I'd encourage you to lean into those edges with me and with others here today, as that's how we're going to make ourselves, our schools, and our classrooms even better for kids this fall and beyond. So we need to have a little community trust, and I believe we can do it. So let's talk a little bit about why we're here today and why we've set up these 6 sessions, really. The values, beliefs, and commitments we shared in the video help us understand the rationale for today's sessions, but also, like I said, all the future sessions that are going to come in this series. Our goals really are to help school communities build culturally relevant literacy communities with the grades 4 and 5 and grades 6 through 12 literacy essentials at the center. We also want to use Dr. Parker's work to empower school communities to honor, value, and amplify identity-affirming, equity-driven instruction that helps all students find joy as readers and writers. And we want to use Dr. Parker's work and the essentials to help us see the abundance of knowledge in our communities, support student voices, and in accordance with our belief that all students can learn and want to learn, that we normalize high expectations for each student. To live into these rationales and to make sure that they become part of our community, we've also developed the following working agreements. Our motto for these sessions and our really grounding belief that we've taken from Dr. Rich Milner is very much start where you are, but don't stay there. We're all learning and growing together. And these sessions are not about having all the answers. They're not about feeling bad or feeling guilty, but they are about learning and growing together to be sure that each student has the best possible learning experience in our classroom and our school. So this means engaging in humble inquiry, committing ourselves to being present, and that means taking care of yourself and this community as needed. We are going to have to embrace and accept non-closure. We have 75 minutes today to talk about identity affirming instruction. This is a beginning, not an end. So it's a pathway. We're not going to solve it all here in this container. And then really importantly, and this is for me too, is just taking a learner stance and understanding that, yes, the answer is in the room and there's a lot of collective wisdom here, and we'll have opportunities to share our collective wisdom. And so just be open to that and, take that stance. So now that we've tackled that, let's dive into some entry points here from Dr. Parker herself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read 4 quotes. Each of these are taken from Dr. Parker's book, Literacy is Liberation. And as I'm reading, I'm going to ask you to pick the one quote that's resonating with you the most right now. And I'm going to ask you to reflect on why that quote is resonating with you. And we can think about our earlier reflection here about what was affirming and inviting in our Reset Equity video. After I read the quotes, I'll give you a minute of reflection time. And then all together, we'll put our numbers in the chat of the quote that is resonating with us most. And this will help us further frame today's conversation. Quote 1, students should not have to negotiate between who they are and how they identify to be successful in our classrooms. To teach children they are smart and to repeatedly teach content that is not intellectually challenging affirms that in reality, the students are not seen as smart or intellectually capable. Teachers should regularly audit their curricula to determine if the tasks they are requiring of their students are rigorous, relevant, aligned with their students' cultural identities and backgrounds. And finally, intentionally create feelings of belongingness, spaces for disagreement, and an overall sense of independence. So take a minute to think about which one of those 4 quotes is resonating with you the most right now. And when you have that number, 1, 2, 3, or 4, put that in the chat and we'll see if there's any patterns that arise. Okay, got lots of 4s to start with. And lots of 4s. Some 2s and some 1s. Oh, that's good. I like that Krista's a rank order them. That's nice. 1 is standing out to some people that's kind of coming through. That's awesome. 4 again. Good. All right, so it looks like we've coalesced here around number 4, which is about intentionally creating feelings of belongingness, spaces for disagreement, and an overall sense of interdependence. These quotes really fall into 4 basic areas, and these come out in the book. Quote number 1 is really about helping students show up as their fullest selves and having success. Students shouldn't need to hide things from us in order to find belonging and find success in our classrooms. 2 is about pushing back on low expectations and resisting that idea of saviorism. Really, we don't want to move into that. That's not helping anybody. And when I think of saviorism, I'm thinking of good intentions meeting low expectations. So we don't want to do that. Number 3 is about how identity affirming instruction helps everybody. And we'll look at some research on that in a minute. And then 4, the one that you've lifted here today, is that really these intentional spaces of hospitality and belonging really matter. And we'll talk about that today, about how to intentionally create that hospitable environment where belongingness, disagreement, and interdependence all exist and coexist. So far, we've got 2 things that we're kind of carrying along with us. We've got our initial reflection from the equity video, which is about what's affirming us and what's inviting us. And now we've kind of, as a community, coalesced around this quote about belongingness. So I just want to, pique our, reiterate or pique our interest about what's in our bucket that we're carrying along. All right, as I said, we are going to check out some research on identity affirming classrooms that might help us dig into that quote that we just chose, number 4, even further, or whatever quote you chose, if it was 1, 2, 3, or 4. And as a note, which I think is really important, when using the word identity, we're referring to really a lot of different identities, including the 8 major identities that you see on the screen. That's race, that's sexual orientation, that's ethnicity, that's ability and disability, gender, class, religion, and nationality. Obviously, we all have these identities, and how they intersect is going to play a role in how we interact with the world. So identity is this really complex thing. I was talking with Laura yesterday, and we were talking about Goldie Muhammad. And it was, we were talking about how identity is both how you see yourself and how others see you, and then how you're enacting those identities. It's a really complicated thing. So what does research tell us about identity affirming classrooms? Well, it tells us that identity affirming classrooms help students' overall academic achievement. When students feel affirmed in who they are, they're more likely to opt into more challenging coursework, and they're more likely to get involved in the school community. We also know that identity affirming classrooms help students value their own identities while celebrating the identities of others, which are skills very much needed in a democratic society. It's important that kids are proud of who they are and that they can celebrate others while understanding, respecting, and really loving the people that are around them. And wrapping this all up, this really requires us as educators to understand our own identities and how they impact our practice and our students. So it goes back to the quote that we lifted as a community to think about really how we are intentionally creating those spaces of belonging and hospitality for kids. But really, it does start with us. As I like to quote Grace Lee Boggs a lot, you know, it's transform yourself to transform the world. So we have to do a little bit of digging. We have to transform ourselves, and then, you know, we can start to really transform our classroom spaces and grow. So we just thought it was important here to tackle a little bit of the research and show you this as another entry point to grow your understanding of identity affirmation and identity affirming spaces. All right. So this is another opportunity that we have to get you involved and hear your voice a little bit more. Building identity affirming classrooms means thinking about our mindsets or core values. That's really at the foundation. And then it involves thinking about our habitual practices, or like what we do every day. And then that's the middle. And then finally, you know, at the end, it's about thinking about how we interact one-on-one with our students, or in small groups with our students. One of the things that I'm really famous for always saying is that we are what we do and we aren't what we don't do. And so it's really important in action to bring that intentional framework into the identity affirming classroom. So taking these ideas and combining it with what you've already are carrying with you in your basket today, your reflection from the equity statement, the quote, the research, we're going to ask you to go into the Padlet and respond to the following questions. And Laura's linking the Padlet in the chat. We're going to ask you to, and you can post as many times under these as you want. We're going to ask you to consider, what is literacy? What do we mean when we say literacy? What do we think about when we say someone's literate? Who and what seems to be valued in those statements, and maybe what doesn't seem to be valued? Then the next column over, we're going to ask you to think about, what is liberation? What does it mean to be liberated? What does this look like in a classroom? How might we free ourselves from harm and discrimination and low expectations? And then finally, we're going to think about, and this is maybe the most challenging one, we're going to think a little bit about how literacy and liberation combine. So how can we combine our definitions of literacy and our notions of freedom to build spaces that are identity affirming, that are rooted in belonging, that do celebrate the great diversity that we have in our classrooms? So take a minute, click on the Padlet, and add your thinking to those columns. This will be important later as we start to unpack them. So we'll give you, we'll give you about 5 minutes here to kind of just jot some things on the Padlet and check in then. All right, the thinking's pouring in, which is great. Keep them coming. Get about 3 minutes. So as you're looking at this, as you're filling this out, and you keep going as you have ideas, I think we're starting to see a few patterns pop up, which is always interesting. On the literacy end, I think we're starting to see that there's some understanding around the ability to communicate with other people through reading and writing. So the ability to really connect through literacy. So that's beautiful. On the liberation side, you know, it's really great. I love that people I love that somebody had lifted access. That's really cool. I think that's awesome. The ability to read the world. That's amazing. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. Freedom, openness, and inclusion of diversity. That's amazing. And then how are these things combining for us? Students will bring fresh, new, and honest perspectives. Helping students be confident to be able to safely express themselves. That's critical for a democratic society. Creating a sage environment. I think there's an article to be written there. Whoever wrote that, publish your thinking. Honoring student identities validates who they are and gives them respect. Yeah, respecting students is really, really critical. Respecting them for who they are, respecting their boundaries, respecting their needs, and just really honoring and valuing that's really, really critical. So this Padlet is active. So if something kind of comes up for you, by all means, please share. I'm going to go back to the presentation. Thanks for putting all that out there. I really do appreciate it, and it's good thinking. It really is, and it will give us a good foundation to talk about some other things that we want to talk about. So we've already done a lot here. Again, what are we carrying with us? We're carrying with us the equity video, the researched entry points, the quote from Dr. Parker herself. And this is going to be an opportunity for us to do a little bit more reflection and think about all those things that we're carrying with us. So we're going to talk for a little bit about, how Dr. Parker in Literacy is Liberation sees literacy. So here's what she says. She says that literacy is abundant, and she encourages us to think about literacies, plural, not just literacy, singular. And that requires us to really consider, if we go back to the last slide, our mindsets and core values. How are we welcoming literacies into our classroom and not narrow versions of literacy? And that can sometimes be a little bit of a tightrope. We know that there are things that we have to do, and we know that there are things that we have to honor as well. So we totally understand that. She also says literacy evolves to meet contexts. So literacy isn't static. As we said in the video, literacy is an evolving practice. And it really depends on the genre, audience, and purpose that the student is writing for. Thirdly, she says that literacy and identities are interrelated and can't be separated. Literacy is part of who we are. I think that's really powerful. Even the youngest writers come to our classrooms with reading and writing identities. Marcel Haddock says this, nobody can be exempt from the identity of reader and writer. So even if you have a negative self-perception of yourself as a reader or a writer, that's still an identity. And it's identity we have to work to cultivate into something more positive, but everybody has reading and writing identities, and they cut deep. So we have to be really intentional and careful about how we're creating positive, lifelong literacy identities for students. And she says some literacies are not honored or valued in schools, but that since literacy and identity are interrelated, this means that some people are not honored or valued in schools. As Dr. Parker says, it's easy to see deficit and not consider maybe all the ways that students are literate because of what we maybe hold and what our institutions hold as literacy and what it means to be literate. So I want to do a little bit of reflection time here. In a second, we're going to go back to the Padlet. And I really want you to consider two things with me. One is the similarities and tensions between our definition of literacy and Dr. Parker's definitions. And then the second thing I want us to do together is think about how these similarities and tensions might impact our mindsets or our core values about literacy and literacy instruction for the upcoming year that's going to start here in just a couple of weeks. I know that August is the longest Sunday night for teachers. So we've got students coming soon, so let's think about that. So for right now, in your notebook or on your Google Doc or in your mind, consider what these definitions of literacy might mean for your mindsets and core values headed into this school year. How will you show students that you trust them and that you value their literacies, plural? How might you include what students know and bring to the classroom into your lessons? We'll have an opportunity to process these a little later on. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes here to just jot some things down. Again, the two things that we want to do, and I'll go back to the Padlet in a second, is to compare our vision of literacy to Dr. Parker's vision. Where are the similarities? Where are the tensions? And then think about how this might drive our core values or mindsets headed into this year about literacy. So give you about 4 or 5 minutes to do that. I'll go back to the Padlet for you so you can see that. So jot these down wherever you feel comfortable. Give you about 30 more seconds to find a spot to end that part of your reflection. Like I said, we'll have an opportunity to process these a little bit later on. So, you know, they're for you, but then they'll also be for the community as we go forward. All right. Thank you for that reflection time. Appreciate you engaging and thinking about these issues. These are big things to think about, and again, we only have this like small container of time to be able to do this, so I definitely appreciate it. We're going to do something similar now, but with liberation. Liberation, it's one of those things that are really complex. It seems really simple to think about what liberation means, but then we think about all that's wrapped up in liberation and all that we need to do to get to a truly liberated space, that it can become challenging and overwhelming. So I think, thinking about what Dr. Parker is going to bring to us here in a second is pretty critical to sort of saying, okay, like, what does that mean for me in my classroom, in the space, in my sphere of influence? So Dr. Parker says about liberation that it's presuming competence for each student. And what does that free us from? Well, it frees us from deficit orientations and mindsets. Beginning with asset-based conceptions of kids, their families, and their identities. That's huge, to intentionally creating a space of hospitality and belonging that affirms students. The second one is really about ending adultism and centering consent. And I find this one to be challenging because it's really about removing ourselves as teachers from the center and making space for students to make their own choices. I think, and Dr. Parker talks about this in the book, but it's easy to slip into, I have this experience, I know best. And sometimes that might be true, but it's also true that students all are bringing different ways of knowing and different funds of knowledge to the classroom, and those are things to respect too. These are whole people, so we need to let them chart their own course in some meaningful way. So freeing us from being at the center is really important to this. And then engaging in identity affirming practices with students, which means ongoing relationship building. We can't have relationship building that is the first week of school that we never revisit. I think community always needs to be built and rebuilt. We can never assume that we have a fully formed community. It's that ongoing, everlasting work. It means honoring all ways of knowing, which we might not have that way of knowing, but it's still a very valid way of knowing. And then celebrating community knowledges. So what do we have in our community that's part of our collective wisdom or collective genius? Again, the three things are presuming competence, ending adultism and centering consent, and engaging in identity affirming practices that recognize students' funds of knowledge. So we're going to do the same thing that we did with the last slide. I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes of reflection time to compare our vision of liberation that we lifted on the Padlet to Dr. Parker's vision, so that we can see both the similarities and the tensions. And then I want you to think not about mindsets or core values so much this time, but I want you to think about what practices that you can use to presume competence, to center students' consent, and to engage in identity affirming practices that recognize students' funds of knowledge. The practice piece is important before we turn you loose on this. The practice piece is important because, again, we are what we do. So again, go back to your notebook, Google Doc, consider these definitions of liberation, and liberation's an active thing, and consider what they might mean, again, for your practices this year. What are you going to continue doing? What might you consider changing in order to create a more identity affirming space for your kids? Like I said, we'll give you like 3 or 4 minutes and I'll go back to the Padlet so that you can see that. And we'll check on you in a couple minutes. I see some people posting like new ideas in the Padlet now that they've had some reflection time and learning space. Feel free to do that too. Like I said, the Padlet's open, and if you've kind of changed your mind or want to revise your thinking, that's totally okay. All right. I'm going to ask you to come in for a landing at this point. Like I said, we'll have time for some debrief and some share out in a little bit. Well, you're smart people, so by now I'm sure that you're seeing the pattern. So the last thing we want to do here is we want to think about how literacy and liberation combine to create identity affirming spaces. At the intersection of literacy and liberation, students' ways of knowing, their funds of knowledge, and their identities are all valued and celebrated. We can use the questions about our mindsets, practices, and relationships to help guide our thinking about how to bring literacy and liberation together to affirm identities in our classroom. We can ask ourselves questions like, how might students know that I value and trust them? What practices affirm students' identities and ways of knowing in your classroom? And what strategies could you use to appropriately get honest feedback from students? At the heart of the identity affirming classroom, where literacy and liberation meet, is what Alex Chevron-Vanette calls unconditional positive regard. The idea that we care for, not just about students. So when we commit to unconditional positive regard, Chevron-Vanette says that it can be a powerful force in helping students have healthy narratives about themselves, and it can even effectively heal damaged or traumatically impacted self-concept. What does this mean? It means holding high expectations for students, recognizing and valuing their ways of knowing, their multiple literacies, plural, and again, honoring their funds of knowledge. So building an identity affirming environment is slow, steady, ongoing work. It's never done, and it isn't magic. So there's there's nothing we could just hand you today that says, like, here, create an identity affirming environment. But we do know, as we talked about in our quote at the beginning, it is intentional. So making students feel honored and valued and encouraging them to honor and value their classmates and communities is really the critical work of schools, or at least part of it. So to make it simple, literacy and liberation occur or intersect in learning spaces where students feel honored and valued. And I love what Dr. Parker says. We need to be committed to learning about our students as any other part of our practice. It matters a lot. So as you look at these questions on the screen, under mindset, practices, and relationships, think about maybe one area that you want to focus on. Mindset being core values, practices, those things that you do every day, and those relationships, those one-to-one or small group moments. And maybe pick a bullet point from one of them. And take the next 3 or 4 minutes on your Google Doc or in your notebook to respond to that question. So you might choose, how might I center relationship building throughout the year more intentionally? That could be something you would choose and write about that. Or maybe you just want to let students know that you value and trust them more. You want to show them that's present in you, but you want to show it more. Think about that for 3 or 4 minutes. So on your Google Doc, in your notebook, on your phone, wherever you're doing these reflections and taking these notes, I'll give you 3 or 4 more minutes of reflection time, and then we will have a little bit of processing time and some breakout time. So we'll be back in 3 or 4 minutes. Give you just about another 30 seconds to kind of think about that question that you've been responding to. And as you're finishing up, again, thank you for reflecting and being vulnerable. As the facilitation tip on the screen says, and as I said at the intro, you might find some edges here. I find some edges here repeatedly that continue to push me and that continue to challenge me. And I think, that can be a scary feeling. But leaning into those edges, and we're going to lean into them, together in a few moments. That's critical to helping us grow, to stay in relationship, to mediate thinking, and to honor progress. Again, I'll quote Rich Milner, who start where you are, but don't stay there. That's really the foundational, the piece. We're not going to have it all together. All at once. So this is really about doing what you can do and taking actionable steps forward. All right, on that note, one last quiet reflection time that we have is, and we'll give you a couple minutes for this, because in a minute, well, a couple of minutes, you'll go into breakout rooms and you'll have an opportunity to kind of debrief and share with people. Been through a lot here today. And I want you as an amazing educator to be able to share with other amazing educators how you're approaching this work and sharing strategies and leaning on each other in community. So these are some things that you can talk about in your breakout room. And like I said, I'll give you a minute of quiet reflection time here before you head out, just so you can collect your thinking. What was new learning for you during today's session? What affirmed your thinking? What pushed your thinking? And if you think about all of this, what's one change that you could make to honor and value student identities in your classroom this school year, and commit to that one action step? One of my favorite quotes from another book that I love is called Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown. And she asks the question, what's the most elegant next step? And what she means by that is, what's the smallest thing you could do to have the biggest impact on your students and your classroom environment, and on that intentional creation of a hospitable, belonging, identity affirming environment. So it's 3:58. I'm going to give you till 4 o'clock to kind of just collect your thoughts, consider these questions. And then at 4 o'clock, we're going to have Laura open the breakout rooms. And, we'll have you in there for a few minutes to debrief and talk to one another, amazing educator to amazing educator. And we'll come back and we'll do a little bit of sharing. And we've got some final announcements that you're not going to want to miss. So stay tuned for those too. So at 4 o'clock, Laura will open the breakout rooms and off you go. All right, when you're ready, you can join the breakout rooms and enjoy your conversation, and we'll bring you back here in a few minutes to debrief. If you need any help getting to your breakout room, we can do that for you too. All right, welcome back, everybody. I know that was not really enough time to debrief and to talk through everything, but we really do want to honor your time and be sure that we let you go at 4:15. So that's why we had to cut it a little bit short, but we do have time for maybe a couple of groups to share out if something, really awesome happened in the breakout room and there was a really great piece of learning that you think we could all benefit from. You can either come off mute or you can hit us up in the chat. Either way works for us. Oh yeah, thank you. Rewarding and honoring effort over results. That can be really critical. This leads into other this conversation obviously has like many different facets to it. One of the things that obviously we could discuss at a different, this is a different session, but like we can discuss how grading and assessment of literacy factor into how identities are affirmed or not affirmed in our classrooms. So there may need to be some rethinking of grading and assessment practices as well to create identity affirming spaces, which again runs up against a lot of systemic issues, but that's definitely present. Discuss having students complete identity maps to build relationships. That's beautiful, Wanda. Thank you. Somewhere Goldie Muhammad is smiling about that. Recognizing their identity and genius. We'll get the sign-in sheet one last time too, just to catch anybody who didn't get to sign in at the start. Andrea says allowing students time to share themselves in the classroom, providing discussion times and times where they can share themselves and their ideas or anything else they want to share. One of the things that I really successfully used to that degree in the classroom was something called commonplace books. We'll be talking about this in our 6th session that Laura and I will be presenting in a couple of weeks. But commonplace books were really composition books that were choice writing spaces where students combine images and writing. It was totally ungraded. And students like wrote about whatever they wanted. And then we had sharing times, and we had times where we would communally write together. And then students, sometimes we did gallery walks, sometimes we did an open mic. Another thing that I'm really famous for saying is, I wanted to create classrooms that were about stories, not stuff. And this was a way to honor stories and not just stuff, right? So I wanted to do that. Rebecca says, creating a space where students not only have a space to speak freely, but want to speak freely. Yeah, that's great. That feeling of safety and comfort. This conversation has many different branches. Like there's a conversation to be had here about restorative practices. to build identity affirming spaces. And next week, Rosalyn Shahid will be talking a little bit about how literature and affirming literature can do some of that healing work with students. So there is a restorative element to literacy. All right. Aaliyah says, we discussed how important it is to give students choices for what they read. Again, next week, that is another part of this, right? We want students to both see themselves, go back to Dr. Sims Bishop, we want mirrors, we want windows, we want sliding glass doors for everybody. Because we know how important that is and how meaningful representation is to creating those hospitable, identity affirming belonging spaces intentionally. Thank you everybody for sharing. We really appreciate that. Those sound like really awesome conversations and really awesome reflections, and we deeply appreciate that. All right, like we said, we do want to get you out of here at 4:15 to really honor your time with us today. Laura has just put 2 s'mores in the chat. We think that there are some really great learning opportunities that we're offering at RISA this year that we want you to be a part of. The first is our equity-based disciplinary literacies network. So if you're interested in learning more about the disciplinary literacy essentials for grades 6 to 12, this is an opportunity to network with other Wayne County teachers to learn more about the essentials and how they actually can look in practice. There's not one way they need to look. This is not just for English teachers either. So if you are in any of the disciplines, the literacy essentials are for you. So we welcome you. Math, science, social studies, electives. Come on down and be our guest at the Equity-Based Disciplinary Literacy Network this year. The meetings are once a month for an hour, and they're virtual, and you do get sketch credit. So you can register there. And then we want to talk really quickly about the Equity Leaders Series. There are so many great names coming to RISA and to Washtenaw ISD this year. The s'more is long because it is just packed with names and brilliance and genius. We're talking about Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz is coming. We're talking about Dr. Alfred Tatum. And excitingly, we are talking about Dr. Kimberly Parker is going to join us. So if you want to learn more about literacy as liberation, you can hear from Dr. Parker herself. She'll be coming on January 31st and February 7th for a 2-part series, which you are more than welcome to sign up for and attend. All the registration links for both EBDLN and the entire Equity Leaders series are on the s'mores that Laura jumped in. And I want to lift what Rosalyn said, equity advocates are welcome. If you are an equity champion, these are spaces for you, right? So we need to stick together. We need to be allies in this work and co-conspirators in this work. So join us for these 2 events. We really appreciate everybody for coming today. It's a lovely evening, so we hope that you have time to enjoy it. And again, get out there. It is already August. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I know that you're both relishing summer and looking forward to welcoming students in a couple of weeks. We'll do it in a really intentional, hospitable, and identity affirming way. Thanks for being here today. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye.